Okay. Now, the very first thing we're going to do, because the Center for the Future of Arizona is an organization that has conducted some amazing polls, is we are going to see um, how much our participants here agree with the results that the Center for the Future of Arizona has been getting. So you should see a poll. Trisha, can you confirm that the poll is up? Okay, great.
Yep, I can see it.
Please answer, and we'll give you a couple of minutes to do so.
About 8% of people have participated so far.
Okay, come on, get busy, people. We have a lot of ground to cover. So let's get some good results here. I'm going to give it one more minute. What's our percent? 58% now. Okay, let's get over 75.
Kathy, I
Yeah,
think they can see all 4 questions right now.
yeah,
Is that
that's
supposed to be
fine.
happening?
Mm-hmm,
Okay,
that's
they're
fine.
answering all 4.
Totally
Okay.
fine. Mm-hmm. Okay, we are at 74%. Come on, people. Let's get to 75 and then I will end the poll. Okay, we just hit
You read
75%.
fast.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Let's see what the results are. Okay, can you see, Trisha, can you confirm that you can see the results?
Yep, I can see not confident for
Okay.
54%.
So let's see. How confident are you that Arizona is prepared for future growth? We have 54% who say not confident. Um, so that's not a ringing endorsement. Do you prefer candidates who are willing to compromise? Wow, 95%. That's pretty amazing. I have to say, I didn't think it would be that high. In general, do you feel the candidates for legislative offices in Arizona are talking about the issues that matter to you? We have yes, 48%, no, 52%. That's a pretty close number. And do you feel the media has created more or less divisiveness? And we have 75% saying more. So very interesting. Kristi, I'll love to hear your thoughts about that. So I will stop sharing and Kristi, take it away.
Okay, thank you so much, Kathy. Well, I'll start off by saying I'm just so excited to be with this group and really thrilled that we have such amazing turnout for the discussion today. So I'm really looking forward to it. I'm going to hold on the poll results. And I think after I give you a little context on our research, I'll sprinkle in some comparison to how the results compare with what we find across Arizona in our research. Definitely some similarities, maybe a couple of contrasts as well. And just wanted to echo I think what you probably picked up on a little bit in my bio is just a strong passion and enthusiasm for civic engagement. And I know that's what brings you all to the conversation today. So I'm really excited to get to connect with so many folks who are passionate about the same things. I started my career really in education first, so in tutoring and mentoring, and then working at a Boys and Girls Club in Boston running education programs. But what I started to realize was that what I was most passionate about was getting other people equally committed to and engaged in access to opportunity for the kiddos that I really cared about that for. So this thread of how do we get more and more people involved in community around creating more opportunity, thriving education systems, making things better for everyone became kind of the thread that guided my work. And that's really what's brought me to the Center for the Future of Arizona as well, doing the work that I do today. So I will share a little bit of backgrounds about our organization and really about our approach to understanding what we call the Arizona we want. I'll share a little bit of data to get us started, but I could go on with lots of data, but I will cut myself off. And then I think we'll just enter into more of a discussion and get to hear what questions are maybe on your minds from Kathy as well. And I will also share some of the references to our research and work where you can really dig in. I understand this is also a group of data enthusiasts like myself, so I'll share some links where you can really find a lot of that information as well. So the first step for me is to make sure I can actually pull up my presentation, which is always the first challenge. So give me just 1 second and we'll get that going. Okay, does that look okay for everybody? Okay, great. So if you're not familiar with the center, just quick background. The Center for the Future of Arizona is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary last year and really have this driving mission of creating a stronger, brighter future for our state. I know that's a big, ambitious mission, so I'll tell you a little bit about how we approach that. And first and foremost, it's really grounded in this vision of the Arizona we want. So one of the early insights from our founding directors, Dr. Lottie Kaur and Sybil Francis, who's our current president and CEO, was that to really develop a center for the future or a vision or a roadmap that needed to come from Arizonans. So we've grounded our work from the beginning in this idea of a shared vision of success that really expresses what we've uncovered from what Arizonans really hope for the future and are really committed to seeing happen. So that vision of the Arizona we want, you'll see kind of tied through today's presentation and through our discussion. The way that we do this work, I think, is helpful just to touch on. We're really data-driven in our approach. So in trying to develop that vision with Arizonans, a CFA partnered early on. So back in 2009, some of you may have been engaged and involved with this work. We partnered with the Gallup polling organization to really identify, how could we do a statewide study in a rigorous research database way to understand what Arizonans were concerned about, what their hopes were for the future. It is still actually the only of its kind study that Gallup has done like this. So taking a state and figuring out how do we kind of poll comprehensively to identify those priorities together. And, I didn't mean to skip, sorry. And then what we've done over time is to say, if we know then what Arizonans want, how do we know how we're doing then in those issues? And that's where the Arizona Progress Meters come into play. I will touch on those a little bit today. But that's a set of data that then measures in each kind of core area, like in education or like in civic engagement or the environment. How do we know then how things are going in those areas? Are we actually getting closer to moving the needle on the things that Arizonans care about? And then finally, our work as a center is to really then dig in and to drive solutions ourselves in partnership with others in communities. So we work really deeply in education, in workforce development, and then in my area in civic engagement. So we have some programs and initiatives that I can tell you about kind of throughout our discussion that's really a reflection of our role is not just to share research and kind of drive communications, but it's also to really be involved in the doing. So Lottie Kaur, who founded the center, used the term do tank to reflect that spirit of not just a think tank, but really to be involved in the implementation and the testing out of new approaches. So the survey research that I will touch on today, as I mentioned, is really meaty and there is a lot of information. So I hope for any of you who are interested that you'll go to these links and actually look at our reports and browse, and you'll also find more interactive data digging in a little more closely on these topics. But just to ground you a little bit in kind of the survey approaches and the distinction between the two, the Gallup survey, which started in 2009, we actually refreshed in 2020. So we're hoping that this becomes an every 10-year kind of milestone for our research and for Arizona to look at where we agree on important issues. So starting in 2009, developed this understanding of the Arizona we want, those core areas of focus. In 2020, we were able to take it one step further to really look at not only the shared public values, but what actions Arizonans really wanted to see that aligned with those values. So we'll touch on that today as well. That has prompted a couple of different things. One, having that research kind of be living and breathing in conversation with others. So what we're doing today are the types of presentations and conversations we have regularly across the state to continue to kind of refine our understanding. What does that survey tell us? But also, how does that kind of show up in today's experience for Arizonans? What would maybe need to be refined or deepened, or how do we kind of understand it further? And one of the initiatives that really kind of spun off from that was the Arizona Voters Agenda. So this was just launched in 2022, and it was really focused on what's on the mind then of Arizona's likely voters. So digging in a little bit more deeply, not just kind of a whole population survey, but to say, particularly in election seasons, and when we have kind of heightened rhetoric and public discourse, what are the things that voters really agree on across party affiliation, across age, and are there gaps between kind of where that consensus is and some of the issues that are sort of repeated in the public dialogue? The idea being, again, to center attention on where the majority of Arizonans agree. So I will touch on a little bit of that briefly in this data, and then we'll jump in. So the headline of all of this, if you didn't yet gather it from kind of the premise and from the, the invitation to join today, is that Arizonans really do agree, and it shows up in this research time and time again through Gallup, through Voters Agenda, through community conversations on what we call these 7 shared public values, which I will go through in just a minute. Something that's really important to know in terms of how we think about consensus from a data point of view is we've drawn lines to really look at not just where are there majorities of folks really gravitating towards issues, but making sure that there's strong support then across subgroups. So for issues that show up in the Gallup survey as part of an action agenda broadly supported by Arizonans, that meant that it had 70% or more agreement across the board, but it also meant when you started to look at political affiliation, geography, age, education, that you'd have that 50% or higher, often much higher, strong support to know where there was really that consensus. In the Voters Agenda, it's a similar mindset, slightly different formula there, but it's having a threshold of the majority of folks had to strongly agree with a statement, and then still having 50% or higher across subgroups agreeing as well. So just giving you a sense when we think about how do we develop kind of narratives or messages about consensus from this data point of view, that's one way that we've approached it. And what that has shown us through this work is these themes of shared public values. So capturing them here at a high level, Arizonans wanting a highly educated and skilled population, wanting affordable healthcare, good paying jobs, sustainable practices. We'll talk a little bit about civic engagement more deeply, given this group's interest today with the data. Fair, just, and equitable treatment of all Arizonans. We'll talk a little bit about that too, I think, in our discussion. And comprehensive immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship, including support for dreamers. So those were things that really emerged from the data as high consensus areas. In addition to shared public values that emerged, as I mentioned, we've polled then and researched where are the actions that kind of align with those. And there's actually an action agenda of over 40 items that align with these areas that we can also share a link to and you can find on our website, but that really start to dig in with where do folks also have a hunger for action and consensus around kind of the path forward. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a quick snapshot in any one of these areas. We could kind of dig in and look at what the data has shown us. I'll show a little bit of our findings for civic engagement and leadership, starting with the Gallup survey. One of the key takeaways, I think, in all of our work and research, but particularly that emerged through that in Gallup 2020, was that Arizonans really want to be working together to solve problems, and that there was this hunger for greater engagement and hunger for systems that were inclusive and representative. So this is just one example of those findings. 76% agreeing they want to be working across difference to solve problems. But what you can see, obviously, is the contrast then with belief that we can do that. That is kind of a common theme in our research, how folks kind of feel or what they're expressing relative to concern about the collective or about our leaders or institutions. So those findings really kind of an interesting contrast. And they really do pair with what we've heard in terms of concern in our leadership. So this data comes from the 2020 Gallup survey. It echoes some of the findings and things we discovered in 2009 Gallup, echoes some of what we'll talk about from the voters agenda as well. But really the idea that Arizonans are concerned about elected leaders and institutions' ability to sort of reflect and realize their values. So at that time, 28% agreeing that we have leaders to get us through tough times. And as you can see, just about a third believe that we have leaders that represent diverse voices, things like using data, focusing on the future, working across party lines, that there isn't that strong belief. Looking nationally, as I'm sure many of you know, and dig in with this research as well, that confidence in leaders and institutions that has been declining over time is a national trend and is certainly showing up in our findings here. Alongside that, part of why we talk about the idea that Arizonans want a democracy that's working for all of us stems from these findings here in our polling around elections. So this was, as further context, fall of 2020, that these questions were fielded. And what you can see is that areas where Arizona is a bright spot nationally, mail-in ballots, early voting, those are really strongly supported. So hitting that 70% or higher thresholds. This first one here, 77% of Arizonans supporting offering automatic voter registration. So that would be a shift. And again, high consensus around mail-in early voting. The other items that weren't quite at that 70%, but still had majority support were offering same-day voter registration and moving to ranked choice voting in state elections. So really interesting findings here to show generally a theme of interest and motivation in having inclusive, accessible, representative elections. We'll talk a little bit about how folks use this data as we go. And then what I would say is that we will have even more exciting information about our elections and civic engagement and democracy coming soon. I had hoped we'd maybe have it ready for today, but we're actually going to be releasing survey 2 of our voters agenda in the next couple of weeks in September that does a deeper dive into elections specifically. But what you can find right now is, as of spring, when we fielded the first voters agenda survey, a lot of rich information around how likely voters are viewing issues in education, state spending, immigration, and housing. And I can touch on some of that in our discussion today, but wanted to make sure you know there is more coming soon, particularly around elections, if that is an area of interest for the group. The last thing that I wanted to touch on before we jump in to discussion was then how we as an organization kind of utilize and make sense of these ideas of civic engagement and democracy. We've used this term of civic health to really capture the broader way that folks come together to identify, define, and then really solve problems. So we think of it as, how do civic participation and connected communities kind of flow together to really build that stronger civic muscle. And part of why that's so important to us at CFA is the idea that it is an end in and of itself that Arizonans care about. So it is a shared public value that Arizonans want greater civic engagement, want a democracy that's working for all of us. But also we believe it to be the means, which I'm sure many of you really see in the work that you're doing, that folks showing up in community, being a part of the process, voting, contributing in the political process, is how we move forward on any of the issues that matter to Arizonans. So really seeing this as like those muscles that we need as a state. So that prompts through our progress meters, wanting to then understand, well, how are we doing then collectively? How are folks engaging? Where are their gaps and what can be done then to drive more solutions and include more in the process? All of this data also available on our website. And what's exciting to me is you can look at subgroups, age, education. You can start to kind of probe these a little bit to look at a deeper story. But the headline here is, with some of our political measures, like, do Arizonans discuss politics? Do we reach out to elected officials? We tend to lag national averages, but to be kind of somewhere in the middle when you look at states across the whole. For purchasing power, interestingly, so this boycotting and boycotting question, Arizona actually has been trending up and leading the nation and has been above the national average, with folks who say, I boycott or boycott a product to express my views. So an interesting way of thinking kind of broadly about how people are engaging in community and making their voices heard. There is something there and an opportunity to build upon. In some of our areas of neighborhood and community engagement, so at the bottom tier, if you're looking at belonging to groups, volunteering, working with neighbors on local issues, the questions in this particular instrument, this is actually federally collected data, they look more not just at formal engagement, but informal. Do you trust your neighbors? Do you talk with them? Do you work together? And unfortunately, Arizona has tended to be one of the last, if not last states in this over time and lagging the national average. Part of why we try to bring attention to this data is the understanding that those kinds of measures of neighborhood engagement, being involved in groups, being involved in causes that you're passionate about at that local level, have spillover effects for individual health, for our broader health, for our political life, for our economic resilience, and so on and so on. So really trying to bring attention to if that these are important areas to look at, and if we are sort of lagging other communities, what might be done about that in particular. And the last piece of information on that from the progress meters is also trying to dig in with then why folks who could vote, who are eligible, are not participating. I find this to be some of the most kind of illuminating research that we have, so I'll spend just a second on it. The source for this is through the current population survey, federally collected, really kind of gold standard in terms of representative. It goes out to about 60,000 households across the country. We have a data partnership where we get analysis on this for Arizona. And after the midterms and presidential election, the survey goes out in November. They ask folks if you're eligible to vote, did you register and did you vote? So instead of just looking at kind of how many ballots were cast through our secretaries of state, which is great data, we're actually getting more of kind of like a profile of folks who vote or don't vote with this survey. And if they were eligible and they didn't, they're asked why. And the leading answer has typically been, especially 2016, it was a much higher response was, I didn't like the candidates was the top answer. There's a whole host of other answers when you look at how the spread kind of plays out. Couldn't get to the polls, wasn't registered, was sick. There's a number of different reasons. But one of the main drivers was saying, I didn't vote because I didn't think that my vote would matter. I didn't think it would make a difference. So what you can see here is in 2016, Arizona had about a fifth of those folks who didn't vote who were eligible not participating for that reason. That was higher than the national average, had started to drop by 2018, stayed pretty level coming off of 2020. By 2022, the US numbers here have stayed pretty level, but Arizona jumped back up with responses on that. So about a quarter then of non-voters saying, I didn't think it would matter. So looking at sort of then underlying causes of voter engagement or disengagement, hoping that this kind of data can prompt more discussion about the why behind that. So I'll just end this portion and then I'm excited to see your chat because I can't multitask to actually look at the chat at the same time. So I'm excited to see the chat, answer questions and jump in. But our intention with a lot of this research is, as I said, to focus on where we agree. How do we continue kind of building awareness and public attention and a public narrative around that, particularly at times when the narrative tends to go to more of the divisive rhetoric, to support others to then use that data. So I'm happy to share examples. We've had some really great ways that partners have used the data to then really drive solutions in response. And then to use this to inform our own work. Like I said, in education, workforce, and civic engagement, where we're actively involved, how can we use all of this information about what Arizonans want to drive where we focus our efforts as well? So we hope to engage you all in the process and hopefully we can talk a little bit about what that looks like or how to continue to engage with us as we jump in. So I'm going to stop the screen so I can then look at all the great chat. And then Kathy would turn it to you for any questions, or if you want me to turn to any questions in the chat too, happy to do that.
For anybody who's involved in civic engagement, to see that last slide, you know, that people feel their votes don't matter, that cuts to the heart. That is very, very tough to hear. I can see some questions in the chat already about, is there any breakdown of that data? Do you have it by party, by age group? Any elaboration you can do on that?
That's such a great question. On that particular question, the most reliable data we can get is at the state level, because they're breaking the sample of eligible voters that they polled into eligible but didn't participate into the reasons why, and the sample starts to get really small. Breaking it down further than looking at age or geography or education would then become too small to report on. But nationally, I can find the link for some of that data nationally that will then probe some of the subgroups because the sample is stronger. And for our other data in Gallup in particular, and in the progress meters, we have really great subgroup information. And we actually with Gallup really invested intensive resources to oversample with groups that are typically underrepresented to make sure that then sample sizes would show up that we could look at across the board. There are some limitations, like for example, in our progress meters data, that's coming from the Census Current Population Survey. They actually don't ask political affiliation when they do that survey, so we don't have that indicator there. But great questions, and hopefully what we share through the upcoming voters agenda on elections will also help round out the picture as well. I think any piece of this information or data taken into kind of a broader view can be really helpful also.
Do you by any chance have any thoughts about how to, and this may be outside of your purview, but how we could address that? I mean, it's very strange. I mean, not only did Chris Mays win as Attorney General by 280 votes out of, a couple of million, but just now in CD3, I believe Raquel Tehran lost her primary by 37 votes, if I'm correct. And also, I've been researching primaries all over the state and found, for the Board of Supervisors and I can't remember what county, but the incumbent lost by 3 votes. I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah, I can share a couple of thoughts. I think broadly part of our intention with sharing the message of the Arizona we want, and then the data that goes behind that, is to create sort of a sense of motivation and inspiration and something collective that will counter the number of things that are likely driving that disengagement and kind of sense of disillusionment that's showing up in our elections, but also showing up maybe across the board. I think folks in the chat are starting to offer some interesting ideas that when we share that this data and presentations often sparks those same questions, particularly from a timeline perspective of thinking about any given election, whether it's sort of election confidence, whether it's Arizona in the center as kind of a swing state. There's a whole host of like maybe competing variables that people are trying to make sense of. I think part of what we're trying to do is create that sense of there is so much agreement and opportunity for action, and opportunity to then get things done, to encourage people to then be a part of it. I will tell you actually about one specific initiative, because this data has really directly inspired and informed work that we're doing that's called school participatory budgeting. I'll call it SPB or PB for short because it's a mouthful. But the process started in Phoenix Union High Schools. We are now involved with scaling it statewide. So anyone who's interested in this today, reach out to me if you have schools in mind that might want to start it. Basically, students are given a portion of their school budget to figure out how to spend on their campus. So it's campus improvement projects. They're given a budget. They work with educators on what the parameters are. And over time, they really kind of learn democracy by doing. They figure out, how are we going to use this money? What are the challenges we need to solve? How can we then create kind of the best, maximize impact with those resources? They campaign, they have a school-wide vote. The students then decide, and that's where the dollars go. I mentioned this because for us, what's really at the core of that initiative is developing that sense of agency, and for young people to develop that sense you do have a role and a place in your community. You do right now in your school community, and your voice deserves to be heard, and you can solve problems, and to do it in a way that's with responsive leadership there, saying, we trust you, we want to hear your ideas, and we will actually make good on what you say is the priority for your campus. So we have started to see, as that process has grown, more and more students, more and more surveys and research, that sense of agency and belief that starts with those small wins for students is really remarkable. And the spillover then that it has for their understanding of, oh, I can show up in my community in these ways. I'm more likely to vote. I want to reach out to my elected officials now about things that I care about. I see a problem in my community, and it's not just kind of a foregone conclusion, it's what can I actually do about that? So we're really excited to see kind of those seeds being planted with young people. There is actually a municipal version of this happening in Tucson, and can happen in any kind of city or town setting too, where residents can then be a part of public budgeting, making those decisions in a very similar process. We're also encouraging folks to look at that. So thinking about ways community-wide, can we get more members of our community to see themselves in that process and to be a part of it, that then might prompt that belief, you matter and your voice and opinion matters, and it matters in our elections as well. So we're thinking about how to use this data, not just in driving voter engagement, but to start early with what are the kind of the root causes of that disconnection or sense that you don't matter or have a place, and how do we address that more early?
Yeah, I love that you talk about agency. That is actually, we talk about active engagement with your state and local government. So, that you are empowered to make a difference. So that is very close to our mission as well. One of the other sort of global thoughts or challenges, I guess I would say, that I wanted to talk about before getting into some individual subject areas is the area of divisiveness in our current political environment particularly. But I mean, looking at the poll we had right at the beginning, 95% want to see more collaboration in our politicians. And also that they feel the media is driving a lot more divisiveness. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts about how to address these divisions that we have and start, on the road to collaboration more actively.
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying I was trying to jot down the poll responses relative to what we found in our research for Arizonans broadly. And as I mentioned at the top, some things track, some things are a little bit distinct, although similar trends. And what we find for across Arizonans, the idea that the majority want leaders who are willing to compromise and work together, as opposed to sort of really firmly standing on a particular platform. So we have about 2/3 of Arizonans responding that way, that they really prioritize and prefer leaders who are willing to compromise. We have about 40%, I think this was actually almost exactly as your poll showed up, about 40% were not confident that we're prepared for future growth. We had a bigger percent that were confident. I think this group is maybe split between not sure. And then thinking about divisiveness in the media and the role that that's played, we had about 85%. So not that different from the group's response to being really concerned about the role of the media in political divisiveness, or the idea of that getting worse. I think, and a lot of our research has kind of echoed this concern. Majorities not saying elected leaders speak to their interests, feeling like they're reflected kind of in the public discourse. So in terms of thoughts on that, one, I think, takeaway for us from the Arizona We Want research has been there is this disconnect between the idea of shared public values, what the majority of our communities want, and then the realities, the policy realities, political realities, the outcomes that folks are experiencing, how folks are experiencing life today in any given area. So when we look at education, we can talk about that separately, or jobs, what folks want relative to then the outcomes that we're seeing. There is a vast divide there. And for us, part of the message from that's come really clear to us in our own work and for others is why civic engagement and civic health then are so critical, and getting to the core of what you're doing, as you said, motivating and engaging more people in the process. is how we start to bridge that gap. So focusing even more attention, investment, resources across our communities, and how are we going to get more Arizonans involved to kind of reverse that cycle. The last thing I would say in terms of solutions is one organization and framework I've turned to that I would share as a really helpful resource is a national group called Our Common Purpose. Some of you may already be kind of plugged in or aware of their work. It was a major undertaking of a bipartisan commission over a period of years out of a think tank, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, that basically came together to say, what do we do about kind of civic renewal and democracy and all of these issues of political polarization, divisiveness, disengagement? What's the solution set here? And they put forward a really rich set, a great set of recommendations on everything from looking at the Supreme Court term limits and representation in the House, so big federal systems issues, down to local issues of how do we design our elections, what's happening in our communities, national service. So I would turn to that, and I can add that to the chat as a really great resource, as a potential set of solutions. And it's really informed our focus at the center on thinking holistically about these issues. If we have issues with kind of our information and media ecosystem, we have issues then with how folks feel about our elections and whether they're designed to be inclusive and representative, about individuals disengaging, that really we need to be working on those things together and creating more of those kind of wheels turning together where there's culture that's prompting and encouraging participation. There's systems that are designed to include and invite and really be responsive to that participation, where we have information flowing in ways that support that. So it does point to sort of an all hands on deck set of solutions that I know all of you are really a part of as well. And yes, Our Common Purpose, thank you, was the group, and I'll make sure to find the link to send along. If not in the chat, then in the follow-up today.
Great, thank you. So why don't we jump into a couple of the subject areas where you found that Arizona has some very robust agreement. And I'd like to start with education. And I always think that education should be a completely nonpartisan issue. I mean, it should be something that we believe in across the board, and yet it seems to have been politicized. So do you think we seem to have lost some of the focus on civic education, I think, in our educational system? And, I can see that might be driving some of the disengagement, but what are some of your findings around our educational system?
Sure, I'm happy to share. And I'll offer just a couple of examples. And then I saw folks in the chat were also referencing some issues we may or may not get into today, like water and transportation infrastructure. So I just want to acknowledge that on most of these issues, there will probably be more rich information and data available than we'll be able to get to. In education, we have a lot of really great findings that echo exactly what you said. Arizonans broadly, through our polling, we have a partnership with Education Forward through their research, have shown how much majorities really want a high quality education system that's working for all kids. There is that contrast, as I mentioned kind of earlier, that tends to show up in how they feel about what we're getting. So for example, in the Gallup poll, 84% saying we need a highly educated, skilled population for our state, and just 26% saying that we currently have that high quality education. So there is that kind of disconnect also that shows up, the hunger for action and for progress with concern. When we poll on specific issue areas, so like in the Gallup survey on education, I'm glancing at some of the findings there. Things like having highly qualified teachers and principals, that was actually the highest consensus item in our whole survey. 92% of Arizonans really supporting finding paths to that. Increasing access to post-secondary, 82%. This question of civic education, 76% of Arizonans saying we need civic education to be a priority in K-12 education. So that consensus and hunger is there. That also shows up in our voters agenda. So looking at likely voters in an election season, these issues around ensuring access to post-secondary, having effective teaching, those make our voters agenda as the really strong support majorities. increasing need-based financial aid for students. Majorities strongly support that. Majorities across groups support that generally. So we're seeing that, like you said, hunger and consensus there. I think within civic education, we've found ourselves, because of the work in school participatory budgeting, really engaging more deeply in kind of the landscape of civic learning and education in Arizona. And part of what we're hoping to contribute with the PB process is the need for more well-rounded civic learning experiences for
Yeah.
students. So the need for, of course, knowledge and content is critical, but having that through immersive learning, through hands-on learning, through experiential learning, we just know that there's a huge gap there in the research of what students get access to, and frankly, how educators feel equipped to deliver civic education. There's a huge gap in educators feeling like they have those strategies at their fingertips. So something that we're doing actually with support from the US Department of Education right now is taking a process like PB and saying, while students are going through this and they're really wrestling with like campaigning, deliberating, voting for these ideas, can we pair that with learning about our actual democratic system? How does that play out in real life campaigns? How have we designed our election systems, and what works and what doesn't work? So really trying to think about, can we bring together some of those strategies and ways that will deepen learning for students, and then again, create that long-term spillover effect where they're more likely to then be engaged active civic participants. So I think there is growing national attention on civic education as a really key issue to be paying attention to. And there's definitely a hunger in our research among Arizonans for focusing on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely struck by the very high percentage of people who feel, we need to pay teachers more. And yet Arizona is 49th in the entire country in terms of per student investment. We have teachers. I mean, it's not that we have a shortage of teachers. We just have so many people who can't afford to teach. They have to take other jobs. And also, the legislature has been disinvesting in both our state universities and more recently our community colleges, which is incredibly frustrating to see this divergence of what people want and yet what our legislature has been doing, what our state government actually does.
Yeah, and when you look at those specific questions too, in terms, I'm not sure if I have data as specific to teacher pay in terms of our research, but just generally on increases in spending. So I'm looking at our Gallup findings in that area, and supporting Arizona should spend more money on K-12 public education, 73% in support of that. Looking at reducing the financial barriers of going to college, 76% in support of that. And then the support for those investments also show up in our Arizona voters agenda. So digging in with those findings from 2022, and then most recently in what we'll release in the next couple of weeks, really echoing a lot of that hunger as well.
You didn't look at anything in your survey that sort of weighed private education versus public education? Did you distinguish that in any of your questions?
So the one question, if I can skim to it quickly enough, was in our voters agenda. Let me see if I can find it. There was one policy item in the first survey of 2024. The statement was private schools that receive state funding should be held to the same standards as public schools when it comes to financial reporting, academic reporting, and employment standards. And we had about 2/3, so 66% in that survey were strongly in support of that statement. And then 80% broadly supported that statement. So the distinction there being that when you start to look at subgroups, making sure majorities across the board support it, and that there is also a majority of really strong support, which helps delineate what kind of makes it into this sort of idea of like a consensus agenda. So that was one question on the distinction between private and public. In terms of polling generally about kind of policy paths or solutions, I'm not sure that I have others to turn to quickly.
Right. I believe there was a comment in the chat about the fact that a lot of this data is dated from 2020, and I believe you said that. Do you have any sense of how any of these areas have been trending? Are you planning to update any of the information so that we can see the trending?
Yes, so I'll say we have a couple of different sources of information that come in at different frequencies. The Gallup agenda or poll, excuse me, is the largest, kind of most expansive study that we do. That one is every 10 years. So we had the 2009 milestone, kind of beginning of that, and then 2020, the research that I'm sharing today. The Arizona Voters Agenda is more current, but it's a different design. It's polling likely voters. It's a little bit of a different approach. And that started in 2022. We're kind of real time collecting and sharing information in 2024. So that's more kind of finger on the pulse information. Alongside that, what I am not digging in as much with today, but would recommend are the Arizona progress meters. So for any given issue that we talk about today, like in education, for example, what we've done is to work with others across the state, leaders in education, to say, so we know what Arizonans want, to your point, Kathy, about this kind of strong consensus drumbeat. We know Arizonans want improvements in this area. Then how do we actually set measurements that can move us toward those goals? So in education, we've developed metrics in everything from early childhood learning through post-secondary attainment. Some of you may be familiar with the Achieve 60 goal, which was set to basically reach 60% of our adult population with those post-secondary credentials. We're at about 46% now. And the idea was to have then real-time data, which we have for any given issue, where you could go to it and say, well, here's where we are as a state. And then in doing that, like in education, to have folks who are advocates, who are organizing, who are policymakers, who are funders, then use that data to inform decision-making. So in some cases, the education progress meter has become sort of a rubric for policy design for leaders in office to say, are we moving the needle? Are we hitting these goals? And if not, what do we need to do to get there? Funders have used that as a rubric for investment. And what's really important, I think, is we have great examples of then folks at the community level really organizing and mobilizing around those goals to say, for example, in Pinal County, we're not close to getting to those goals in our community. And we know that really important jobs are landing here. What is it going to take across K-12 educators, the business community, the policy community to come together to really drive some solutions? So we've been involved with and really excited about seeing some of that movement. So that's all to say that some of that data is much more kind of real time that we hope can inform your efforts. The bigger picture research like Gallup will be a few more years before it comes back around.
Yeah. I'm definitely very interested in, some of the areas where we seem to be so far from our goals or so far from what we think is important. What are the actions that we can take to move that needle? So I want to jump into jobs and the economy, and which is always stated as one of the most important, if not the most important issue that people care about. What do you see in your data that points to things that the state should do or that communities should do to encourage job creation and create a really healthy, multifaceted economy?
Sure. So I'll offer a couple of examples, also kind of looking at some of our data from Gallup, and then as we look into the more kind of current voters agenda findings on the economy broadly. I think what emerged from the Gallup survey was focus on creating more opportunities for economic stability, particularly for lower wage workers. When we looked at questions around job satisfaction, so are you satisfied with your work benefits, with your opportunities to advance, equal pay, growing your career, work leave policies? There is a huge break when you look at income. So folks earning 60,000 or more, and then income under 60,000, you can see these significant gaps in workplace satisfaction, job satisfaction across the board. So that prompting this attention to needing to create those opportunities more equitably across the board, I think was one thing that really leapt out from the Gallup survey. The other finding I would share that I think is really interesting because it also, all of these things reinforce each other, right? So looking at where are there things that show those connections, and access to childcare being a really important factor. in jobs and in the economy. So when asking parents in particular, is limited availability of childcare preventing you from going back to work? Really significant numbers reporting yes, about a third saying yes, not having childcare or cost of childcare preventing me from going back to work. So looking back at that 60% attainment goal, if we have parents saying at these high levels, I can't go back to school or to work because of the issue of childcare, and we're trying to move the needle on getting more adults with those post-secondary credentials and trying to solve some of these issues in access to good jobs, that presents a path and a kind of a policy and a whole solution set that goes along with it. So that's, I think, one type of finding that we've seen others really use and drive discussions then about what's needed. The last thing I'll say in terms of what we've learned and heard from Arizonans on the economy broadly, these are findings from our most recent 2024 Arizona Voters Agenda, the interest in investment. So there was strong opposition to cuts. So cuts to K-12 education to balance the budget, 73% strongly oppose that. Cuts to public safety to balance the budget, 64% strongly oppose that. Cuts to healthcare to balance the budget, 61% strongly opposed. And then looking at the need for making sure we're prepared for growth. I think someone mentioned infrastructure, transportation. Those were statements like Arizona is expected to reach 8 million residents by 2030, 9 million by 2040. It will take higher levels of planning and preparedness to ensure we have the resources and infrastructure to support that growth and maintain our high quality of life. That was an example of something that then made that cut of high consensus. Also, the issue of childcare. Arizona should invest more in childcare assistance programs for qualifying families, hit that threshold of strong support, and then general agreement. So again, taking that view of kind of Arizonans wanting good jobs, equitable access to opportunity, and then kind of broadly thinking about spending. That's some of what we've been finding.
Yeah. I always see, as somebody who comes from a business background, I always see a disconnect between investment and revenue, because people also hate to pay taxes, but on the other hand, that is revenue that is needed for that investment. So before we're bumping up against the hour. So I just want to ask one more question, which is about immigration. This has turned into one of the most divisive issues, and yet the findings in your poll show a great deal of support for immigrants who contribute to the health of our economy. And the fact that they strengthen our state, and also a tremendous amount of support for DACA, and a path to citizenship. So, we're looking at an issue that will be on our ballot. I think it's Prop 314. That would basically criminalize, deputize state police to arrest people that they feel may have crossed the border illegally. So it's very distressing to see a ballot measure that is so divisive. And yet, I feel that some of your research is really pointing in the opposite direction.
Yes. Yeah, that's absolutely right. The Gallup survey, one of the higher consensus items throughout all of that research was on immigration. So it was 86% supporting comprehensive immigration reform with a pathway to citizenship. And then specifically a question asked about a pathway to citizenship for Dreamers, and 86% also supporting that. So that came through very clearly. I think in the voters agenda, the data that was just released from the spring immigration is looked at, so can encourage everyone to look a little more closely at that survey research, but I have a couple of the findings here, again echoed that comprehensive immigration reform that includes a pathway to citizenship hit that threshold of 56% strongly agree, 77% total agree, so of likely voters, real time kind of 2024. And then also the two statements that made the voters' agenda there. Immigration reform is important to our country and our economy. Mexico is Arizona's largest trade and tourism partner. We must prioritize creating a functioning border for commerce and immigration. 66% strongly agree, 89% agree. and also the idea of the need for action. So the other statement was the current influx of thousands of migrants at the southern border is an international humanitarian and refugee crisis. Our leaders must work together to find a bipartisan solution. 62% strongly agreeing, 82% agreeing with that assessment. So your point that there is, again, consensus on hunger for action on that, I think is very much reflected in the data. And again, sort of returns in any one of these particular policy areas, returns to that need for greater engagement of creating systems that are designed to encourage that engagement, and then motivating and inspired more and more people to be a part of the process so that we get closer to really making progress on those shared values.
Yeah. Oh, I really hate the fact that we're on the hour right now. There's so many other questions I'd like to ask. Did you say that infrastructure and transportation will come up on the, some of the upcoming surveys? And also, did you say affordable housing as well?
Yes, so housing is one of the areas that's really explored in our most recent spring 2024 Arizona Voters Agenda.
Oh, okay.
So folks can look at that there. Was also touched
Mhm.
on in the Gallup survey. And then in our Gallup survey report, which you're able to download on our website, transportation and infrastructure are a big part of sort of the initial part of that report, looking at growth and kind of where we are, and access. So folks reporting on access to transportation, concerns about transportation, but kind of broader infrastructure issues as well. I know someone had mentioned water. Water is absolutely a key priority, and a lot of research on that in Gallup and in the voters agenda as well. So hopefully for the topics that we didn't kind of touch on today, for those of you finding some of that research will be helpful. And then I am always happy to either field questions as you have them, or to put you in touch with our data lead, or to be supportive on things that you really would like to get kind of a closer look at if you're not able to find that too.
Okay. Well, I will send out a lot of links in my follow-up email. So are there any final words you'd like to leave us with?
I think I would just encourage any of you who are interested, ways that we can get involved and work together, sharing this information. We hope that what we've provided and how it's packaged through our website, toolkits, resources, presentations, can be useful to share with others, with that intention that we talked about at the beginning, creating this sense of possibility, of optimism, that there is this support and consensus in areas where we really can come together to make progress. So using that hopefully as a way to reinforce that message of the work that you all do to encourage others to get involved. And then specifically in the issue areas that I'm sure many of you are passionate about, similarly being able to use that data to bolster and kind of animate and inform your work. And then in areas of collaboration, I mentioned participatory budgeting because it happens to be my favorite project. And because I know many of you probably know or are involved in school communities who would just be like the perfect place to get that off the ground. So I'd really encourage, are there ways that we could work together to get that work moving as well? But just being
Absolutely.
here and being a part of it is obviously such an amazing group. So just excited to get to connect with you all today.
Great. Well, I will certainly not only send out links, but I'll be, including some of your information as we go along through the year. So happy to do anything that we can to show, the amazing work that you're doing.
Thank you so
So
much. I appreciate it.
thank everyone so much for coming. I really appreciate it, and look for an email with a bunch of follow-ups. So thank you so much, Kristi. I really appreciate it.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you. Take care. Have a great evening.
Okay. Bye, everyone.